Now, this is the Japanese style education which transcends the national borders for the historical multilateral understanding. 130 people have been registered, and the number is increasing, and this is our third one for this lecture, and we are very much encouraged. So far, we have had 2 lectures, and I'd like to, based upon these 2 previous lectures, I'd like to put Professor Komagome as a lecture in perspective, and then introduce him, and then followed by the lecture, and then followed by the discussion for 20-30 minutes. This is what we're going to do today. The first one took place in the second half of July from Brazil School of Kyoto University. Emira Shimabukuro talked about the perseverance and the rhetorical term written in the diary, written in the concentration camps for the Japanese Americans, analyzing the diary and the writing by the Japanese American in the concentration camp GAMAN, GAMAN. The concept of this as a rhetorical term and the meaning of writing, and also in relation with the political movement of Japanese Americans. Second was the second half of August, intended discontinuation and non-intended continuance from the school documents of the Taiwan and Korea in 1945. The speaker was Hiura Satoko, the researcher at the National Historical Ethnic Museum. And this is a document to record the inventory of the materials and events that was introduced in the school in Taiwan and Korea under the control of the colonization, but to continue for a long time after the liberalization in 1945. If you try to explore the element of the Japanese style education, as the title says, for the expansion of this education system to the other countries, if you try to find something in common, there is a contrasting role which has been played. The concept of perseverance, and if you think that writing diary is a typical Japanese, which was written in the concentration camp, which is extreme conditions, this was used as a resource for the survival of the Japanese Americans, and it led to the vindication movement in the 1980s. This is a typical Japanese education, but supported the resistance against the racial discrimination. Now, on the other hand, in the colonized Korea and Taiwan, actually this was used as an extension of those who execute racial discrimination as part of the national organization. These are 2 extreme, but there's one thing common. That is to say, the act of writing and also the issue of identity. Japanese Americans, immigrants, through the concept of gaman, perseverance, express the anger about the present and hope for the future. And also this was an act to confirm the solidarity with the brothers, which share the common torment. And Hiura-san talked about the Taiwan and Korea after the liberalization from the colonization by Japan, continued to keep the practice of keeping the record of the school, starting from the purpose of the control by the colonizer. But after the liberalization, it was used for the record of the history of the school after the liberation. This was reconstructed and constructed as the identity of the school. This is a new meaning. So the act of writing is related with the formation and the creation of the collective identity. This was quite impressive. Now, at this time, the lecture would deal with the instruction of writing, which is quite unique, Seikatsu Tsuzurikata, daily life writing, the Japanese practice of education, particularly entire Japan in the 1920s and the 30s before the war, expanded to particularly to agricultural villages, and resurrected in 1950s after the war, and lead to the series of the Children of the World by Heibonsha Publishing Company, asking children to write about their life as it is. This practice is for the instructions of writing, but also to understand the situation from the macroscopic perspective, and the children would learn the social or critical perspective. And also, through the act of writing, it is possible to share the common experiences in the class, in the region, in the country, and also in the world. This is the act of obtaining the new identity or the self-consciousness. Now, Professor Komagome, today's speaker, is a professor of the Department of the Educational Research, and he is specialized with education in the colonized country by Japan, and also wrote a lot of books about colonization and imperial history. And recently he wrote about the post-war history edited through Seikatsu Tsuzurikata, 1950s, from Cold War and the Transcending National Borders by Madame Shoten Publishing Company, and Taiwan colonization control in the world history from the viewpoint of the Tainan Chandan Middle School by Iwanami Shoten. And typical Japanese, but this practice went through the process of transcending borders through the project of the Children of the World. How it is refined, what kind of transformation it has led. Professor Komagome, please. Hello, I'm Komagome. Very happy to meet you all. Today, I would like to talk about the theme of the issue of the translation seen in the Children of the World, and the Seikatsu Tsuzurikata, daily life of writing, which spread its wings in the world. And this DLW, daily life of writing, is a typical composition which was considered important in the Japanese private education movement. What kind of composition are they? Why did I put a question mark at the end of Seikatsu Tsuzurikata, the LW, which spread its wing in the world? I would try to clarify those points in my presentation today. Before I start, I'd like to remind you that what I'm going to talk today is based upon the book entitled The Post-War History, edited through the LW. You see the list of the authors on the left. This is the result of the joint research of 15 persons who participated in my seminar. Collection, organization, interpretation of the materials have been done as a joint work. However, today I'm going to talk about this result of the joint research as if I alone had done this all by myself. But on the right-hand side, this book is quite popular, and the price is 4,900 yen, and the list price a bit expensive though. Today, I would like to talk about first what kind of book it is, The Children of the World. I would like to talk about first the overview, and then I would like to clarify the purpose of this book, take an example of the volume of France. You see the title page. And what kind of composition were considered typical as the LW? I would like to go back to the process of the collection of writings from France, UK, China, and Taiwan. And through this process, I believe that the issue of the translation would emerge. And also, I'd like to think here, not the translation of each pieces of the writing, but I'd like to talk about how to translate and communicate the concept of the LW, daily life writing itself. And I'd like to go back to the process of editing for this purpose. daily life writing, Seikatsu Tsuzurikata, may have some the vague image you may conjure up. But in China and France, when we tried to collect compositions, we needed to explain in English and French and Chinese for them to understand. That's why there is the emerging issue of a translation. Now, I'd like to confirm the basics of what kind of book it is, The Children of the World. There are 15 volumes, and there's one of the Japanese children. This is a Japanese volume, and this is illustration inserted in the volume of Japan. At a glance, this is a kind of image of the strange collage, which is deformed. I'm magnifying it. You may think that you see Fuji mountain, Mount Fuji at the center, but actually this is the mountain on the right bottom side, which is very small. And actually at the center, this is the image of the logging process and carrying the lumber from the mountain. The book of Children of the World is the auxiliary teaching material of the social studies of the primary school and junior high school, and reading material for children. And the editorial department of Heibonsha Publishing Company collected, translated, edited the composition written by the children of various parts of the world and published it. And this is a sequel to the composition Topography, which is a collection of the Japanese children's composition. And 15 volumes were published from 1955 to 1957. This is the list of 15 volumes. In Japanese society, sometimes it is ignored. Latin America, Africa, all of these various areas of the world were under scope of this project. Our joint research, depending upon the language that we could read, and therefore we analyzed the third volume on China and Korea, and the ninth volume of Western Europe #1, that is France. On the right-hand side, you see the picture of the editor-in-chief, Yoshida Kusuho. Most of the material that I'm going to use today in my presentation has been preserved personally by Mr. Yoshida for over half a century. And Tsunada-san was assigned this 30 boxes of the documents when Mr. Yoshida passed away. This is the voluminous material. This plan and the project was formed at the juncture of the daily life writing movement, Esperanto movement, and the peace movement. And the DLW movement is symbolized by Nartita Chukyu and Kokubu Ichitaro. And Narita started up the Hoppo Kyoikusha company in Akita prefecture before the war. And Kokubu participated in this activity of Kyoikusha and then became the leader of the post-war DLW movement. On the right-hand side, this is Yoshida Kusuho. In this picture, Kokubu Ichitaro, and the partner in the back, and also his son and daughter. And this person is Muchaku Seikyo, famous for the editor of the composition and the collection called Echo from the Mountain School. In addition, the famous esperantist was contracted by Heibonsha Publishing Company in charge of the communication with overseas countries. In addition, the president of Heibonsha Publishing Company, Shimonaka Yasaburo, was the representative person symbolizing the peace movement in 1950s. These are the people involved in the LW and Esperanto movements and the peace movement. They were connected in an interrelated manner, and finally this project of World Children was initiated. This image shows the Japanese domestic news, national news. This is published for the collaborators in Japan by the editorial department of Heibonsha Publishing Company, Children of the World. The second is on the right. Nartita Chukyu explained the purpose of the publishment of this book. This, I wish, is going to be the opportunity and that DLW education would be known to the world. This is unique. I think that Japan can be proud of to the entire world. This may sound exaggerated, but at that time he was so proud as well as he was so committed to this mission. On the left-hand side, you see another national news. You see the title that the Japanese competition movement, which is extending to the world. This is not just a collection of the composition written by the children in various parts of the world, but this was intended to disseminate the Japanese unique competition education movement to the entire world.
Well then, let's look at some pages of the French volume. It was published first among all the 15 volumes. These are some of the pages showing block prints made by French children. Men and women working in villages and towns. You can also see the names and ages of the children who made those artworks. Please pay attention to the red box in the left top corner. It says, quote, "When my younger sister and I looked out from the cart full of hay, we can see men and women working in various parts of France." Unquote. Such a sentence suggests that editors consider depicting working people as important. There are many writings by children in this volume. Let me read one work written by a 13-year-old boy named André Gay. The title is Growing Vegetables. Let me read the red box. Quote, "My father gets up at 4 in the morning and goes to the market to sell the vegetables he has grown with care. What do you think happens? Most vegetables didn't sell. Some sold, but only at greatly reduced prices. This is ridiculous," father says disappointedly, and goes to the farm fixing a nozzle on a sprinkler. The soil is so dry that he has to water it. "These tomatoes are great tomatoes, but the market is flooded with them," father says in desperation and waters the land. He received a purchase order for celery. He was glad and looked very happy. But he has to pay for the fertilizer, and electricity bill, and insecticides. He also has to dig the well again as it has gone dry. Furthermore, he has to repair the glass roof and pay the bill for the machine repair. What produce can make ends meet? He grumbled. Unquote. And the roof prefecture, André Gay. That's the end of this writing. There's one thing I'd like to confirm with you about this writing, which is a feature common to many writings in this volume. That is, it doesn't have a happy ending. It does not show any good idea or any determination to take a certain action. Perhaps maybe in Japan only, perhaps in other countries too. I'm sure that many of you were instructed to write writings, and on such a social issue, children often presents a resolution that he or she has to do this or that. That seems to be an expected ending to a writing by children in Japan, and also teachers expect them to write such a resolution toward the end. But the ending of this particular writing is, he grumbled, father grumbled. I will come back to this point later, but such a writing in this volume only points to a serious labor issue which is hanging in the air without any solution presented. So that's one important feature of daily life writing style. The writing is followed by another writing in the volume. The editorial staff didn't insert comments or explanation to every single writing, but they used graphs and drawings to explain the social context behind an individual event. For example, the drawing on the left compares the wages of factory workers and farmers, a very big gap between the two levels. And in this red box, it says as follows, quote, in August 1953, 120,000 grape growers in southern France, tormented by 40% price drop of grapes and 100% price hike of ammonium sulfate, barricaded streets and refused to ship grapes. Unquote. Ammonium sulfate is one of the fertilizers. I also do some gardening, growing vegetables. And ammonium sulfate is a fertilizer necessary to turn soil into an acidic side. But of course, they have to have cash to pay for ammonium sulfate. But no matter how much they grow vegetables, they are sold only at an extremely reduced price. That was the dilemma. The essay I read earlier, Growing Vegetables, mentions the pain of paying for fertilizer. And this explanation in this graph presents an objective fact about the fertilizer prices. However, by and large, the writing and the drawing are not presented as an inseparable pair. Readers can read the essay independent of the drawing and vice versa. That's how this book is structured. Children of Kamitoba Primary School of Kyoto City wrote compositions after they read the French volume. Those writings were kept and preserved because Yoshida, the editor-in-chief, preserved them so well. The student of this competition says, I thought everyone in France was rich, but I was grossly wrong. Unquote. The supporters and advocates of Seikatsu Tsuzurikata movement used the term gainen kudaki, breaking down of concepts, to emphasize the importance of challenging stereotypes and preconceived ideas. In this particular example, a preconceived idea or stereotype about France was broken down. Another student of the same primary school wrote about his reactions to growing vegetables essay. A quote, the teacher read for us growing vegetables in France. Like in Japan, vegetables were very cheap. They have to get up early in the morning to go to the market, and that's the same for my family. So, in this manner, the student is feeling that the situation is more or less the same between their family and the boys in France family. And then, in the red box, the student says, I wonder how André Gate's father's face looked if the vegetables were sold at good prices. He then says, when my father's sell his vegetables at good prices, he smiles, making wrinkles on the eyelids. I wonder how André Gate's father's face looked. Unquote. The important point about this particular writing is that this student specifically mentions the name of the French boy, André Gay, who really lived in France when he expresses his empathy toward him. Some children wanted to have a mail correspondence with French students after they read their writings. Kokubu Ichitaro, an editorial staff of Children of the World, describes the significance of compiling this book by gathering the writings by not imaginary but real children. He says, quote, it is to let the Japanese children know as is that in foreign countries there live children named John, Ivan, Tom, Anne, Enrico, and Lee, and like the Japanese children, they have lives, hearts, eyes that see well, brains that think well, hearts that feel well, and they have a common hope to live well, and live beautifully. And for this hope, they play in the nature, fight with the nature, live among people, fight against evil, lies, and ugliness of people. They are moved by the goodness, truth, and the beauty of people, and they continue to do so even today. Why is this important? And in order for this to this, not imaginary persons such as Heidi in the Alps cannot be used. It's important that the children in Japan get in touch with the real children living in other countries. And Kokubu continues to say as follows, quote, why is this important? Needless to say, it is because we want to solidify the love of humanity and the spirit of international friendship from their foundation. It is to provide them, since when they were very small, with education which encouraged them to seek for the biggest dream, the peace of humankind, unquote. After Kokubu said to live, he added to live beautifully, unquote. And he continued to say, quote, to keep them as a common hope common to the humankind, unquote. In this particular passage, he clearly states why Seikatsu Tsuzurikata, DLW, is necessary and important to realize peace education, saying let's be friends with each other, let's not fight with each other, saying those are not enough according to him. Children of the World includes quite a few writings about war experiences, but it also positions a writing like growing vegetables in a context of promoting empathy and understanding each other's daily life, and that is considered as a way toward realizing the peace. So now I'd like to enter into the second part of my talk. So far, I have shown characteristics and objectives of the children of the world by taking examples of the parts where editorial goal seemed to have been accomplished rather smoothly. But as we read them carefully, and not just reading the book, but also reading through and analyzing the editing process of the book, we can find that there were various misunderstandings and disagreements between the editorial staff and collaborators in other countries. The central issue of such disagreements and misunderstanding was what writing would make Seikatsu Tsuzurikata DLW. This is an international newsletter issued to prospective collaborators in the world who would help collect writings for the book. And the title says, what kind of writings we want? What kind of writings do we want? The fact that the editorial staff had to write such a newsletter indicate the difficulty of gathering the kind of writings DLW they wanted from other countries.
This is the second issue of the international news. The part of it. The title of this is We Want Documentary Writings. As you see, I try to translate the part indicated with red. What we need is a documentary writings by children, the realistic records of a children's life, written by their own hand, not the explanatory information. Let them describe as they see, hear, and feel about their own everyday life, their parents' life, life in their cities and their villages, so that we may see clearly scenes and situations in their life. We do not expect of them refined literary works, but works full of life, however crude their expression may be. The question is realism. The core, the concept is realism. This Japanese translation is my tentative translation, and I did it and find it actually difficult. For instance, it says documentary writings, and I translated into documentary-like compositions. But when we think about the documentary, this is kind of history, the records. Are we going to use exactly the same words in Japanese? This is quite a subtle thing which occur in the effort of a translation. And therefore, the editors, editorial department, were thinking about the W that they intended to have, but actually explaining them to other people was considered to be extremely difficult. Now, based upon these interactions, the editorial department of Heibonsha Publishing Company prepared this material for their own discussion. On the right-hand side, you see the minute, sort of, which was the material to carry out this conference in the editing department. And actually, there's a mountainous volume of this material. So what kind of the composition that they want them to write? The reality of the territory, when we ask them to write about industry, intended to have, but they tend to write a tourist guide and the manual of the factory and the history of the village. Very explanatory, but we want them to write about the day-to-day, daily life experiences, diary in details with conversation and the sketches. This is the primary thing. And also, the observation should be added. This is going to be the most desirable material for us. Unquote. For instance, as one of the examples, they presented the diary written by the 7-year-old American child, and they said, this is what we want. when we think about diaries, most of the people in the world, for instance, you can conjure up the image of diaries easily. However, this explanation calls another question, the new question. Okay, this is a diary. However, why is it so important to have the composition like a diary? And why do we write a diary at school? What does it mean to write a diary at school? And even publishing it. Publishing diaries in some cases. But when it comes to that publication issue, this may be a deviation from the essence of the diary. You may have the image of a diary clearly, but why is it so important? Why do you have to share widely? On this point, this is the obvious question that they had when they were asked to present diaries. Now, in addition to the explanation using the term diary, there are many DLW compositions. They have examples in the English and the Chinese, and they sent them to collaborators. This is example of echo from the mountain school. This represents the symbol of the resurrection of the DLW movement in the post-war Japan. Only 1 year after the publication, it sold 100,000 copies. And the left-hand side is a Japanese version. I'm sorry that this is a black and white version, but in Chinese. The title, the cover, the picture is the same, so you cannot see the difference, but the Biko of Yama is written in the Chinese characters, and also before the Yamagata prefecture, it says Japan in the version Chinese. On the right-hand side is a translation into English, published in 1953, and Echoes from the Mountain School was the translation of the Japanese title. In the Echo from the Mountain School, the left-hand side and bottom part, you are looking at the composition entitled My Mother's Death and What Happened After That, written by Eguchi Koichi. My family was poor, and in the Yamamoto village, probably the poorest family in the village. Quite direct and honest start of the composition. In the middle is a translation into Chinese. Fairly correct and detailed word-to-word translation is given, and the English version on the right, but more freely translated. I don't know, but in 1950s, when the Echo from the Mountain School was published, followed quickly by the version in Chinese and English as well. This is a track record, and which is very important premise for the publication of the Children of the World. And this Chinese version indicates, as example, what kind of a composition that editorial department wanted. And this is a version in Esperanto. Japanese composition is put into this collection in the language of Esperanto. And also there's a journal before the Japanese, the topography and the 13 compositions were translated in Esperanto and sent to the collaborators and also distributed at the Congress of Esperanto. This Nagasan, one of the members, became the Esperantist after this event. The issue of Esperanto is here. This is a typical the writing which depicts it. The Esperanto is not international the language, but trans-ethnical language. First, the dike divide people, but put a hole, and then water started to leak, and finally the dike of the national border would collapse. That is the purpose of the movement of Esperanto. Actually, this word describes exactly what was the purpose of this, the publication of the children of the world. Then, so far, they try to collect composition from various parts of the world. I would like to move on to the reaction from those collaborating countries. As I mentioned before, international news was published by the editorial department, and the English version of the Echo from the Mountain School was issued as well, and also they made the booklet written in Esperanto as well. But if you look at communication between the collaborators in the world and the Japanese editorial department, we can see many misunderstandings and conflicts. I would like to take up the reaction from France. One of the important local collaborators was Frossal, who was in charge of the free education, which is a free education movement, and also Esperantist, and a poet, and the literary authors. And Frossal wrote a letter to the editorial department of Heibonsha Publishing Company, which is translated into Japanese, as follows. When collecting the composition written by the children, there is a great problem. That is the disparity of the thinking about the social nature of the composition. There is a disparity between your thinking and the thinking of the teachers of the free composition. When we try to select the compositions, for instance, several thousand compositions were read. For instance, you can find the world of the dream and the imagination dominates the composition written by the French children. But on the other hand, if you look at the Japanese children's composition, there's no imagination, imaginative stories, no conte, no fantasy. The Frossal depicted these differences very clearly, so what we want and what you want are quite different. And he quickly added that I read the letter sent by the editorial department from Japan, and there is not the lack of spontaneity on the part of the Japanese children, not just because it's not imaginative. It does not mean that there is no fantasy, no dream, no imagination. It is wrong to quickly come to this conclusion. For instance, a succinct and astute realism, which can be observed in the Japanese composition, is supported by the sensibility of the children and the poetic sensitivity of the Japanese children. So this does not deny the spontaneity of the children, not to deny the poetic senses of the children. However, still there is the perplexed feeling and the differences, and then he added to say as follows. French composition are not social and political because the French school has a different taboos. French school requested to keep the neutrality regarding the social and the political issues. And the teachers are resistant to taking social and peace positions. And also the religions and not going beyond understanding on the part of the children. These are 4 factors. So these are 4 factors. When you think about the DLW movement, are quite important, the points. Although they are important, but the DLW teachers didn't ignore the neutrality of the social or political issues, and not the teacher impose their social and political position to the children. If time allows, I would like to explain that later. Frossau introduced the project of the Children of the World in his own journal that he edited and featured the children of the world. As you see the picture on the right hand side, that is the cover page of the book, and introduce the details of the children of the world, and also in the detailed part of the volume of France, introduce the composition written by the French, and also the reactions and observation from the Japanese children are introduced as well. When Japanese children read the composition written by French children, this transmitted to French children, and then French children reacted to the observation done by the Japanese children. Interestingly, there's a perspective of Japan regarding the description of daily life, how the DLW was formed and developed. This is a kind of the history of the formation of DLW movement. In summary, Heibonsha Publishing Company editorial department furnished the information in which you can read that DLW movement originated from the Ikebukuro Children's Village Elementary School, oriented to the free education. In the Taisho period, the new education movement. As you may know, Ikebukuro Jidonomura Elementary in 1924, the children were free to choose the time and the place, and the children are free to choose the teachers. The complete freedom is given to the children in the elementary school. This is experimentally primary school. And during the 2 years or 1 year, completely children were playing, and a new type of education, it was called daily life education, was conceived. And through this process, they place importance upon the daily life writing. This kind of interpretation from the viewpoint of the education history is quite important, because it does not negate the autonomy and the spontaneity of the children.
So French volume was published out of various disagreements or confrontation. However, to a great degree, a mutual understanding was quite advanced. What about reaction from the UK? It was more cold-shouldered, I would like to say, in comparison to the reaction from the UK. As the newsletter from France says, we received many writings from the UK, but it showed the following features. That is, There were too many writings about the same theme, and most themes are too broad and abstract. For instance, Christmas and the way children live a daily life in the UK as examples. And the editorial staff even said that most of the writings were unusable. What about a British collaborator like Froissart in case of France? They presented the following views. It required a certain talent to write such a very peculiar writing. And also they say that British children don't have the custom of writing about their family life. So, in a sense, this is a question, a kind of a challenge they presented to Seikatsu Tsuzurikata's style of writing. And the editorial staff commented to this by saying that there seemed to be a tendency common to countries where modern sense of individualism is formed based upon their history, unquote. So in a sense, they were rather taken aback by this reaction from the UK, but on the other hand, it was more or less understandable to them. So Seikatsu Tsuzurikata, in this case, toward Europe, and in a way to collect the writings from Europe, it faced a problem of privacy of family life. I put a question mark to the title of my talk, Seikatsu Tsuzurikata, Flying to the World, and a question mark. Seikatsu Tsuzurikata was not understood so easily by collaborators around the world. Rather, there was a sort of criticism toward such a writing style and movement. Now, reaction from China. We just saw reactions from France and the UK, and there was a difficulty of a quite different dimension in case of China. The editorial staff first approached the translator of Yamabiko's school into Chinese. But this person forwarded this request to the government-backed organization called Children's National Committee of People Protection. And also they got in touch with esperantists in China, but they also forwarded their request to a government organization. So collecting writings from China through a personal network was very difficult, and that was clear early on to the editorial staff. Furthermore, this Chinese National Committee of Children and another organization such as the China People's External Culture Association were in reality governed by the Chinese Communist Party, although it was said that they were grassroots civic organizations. The table in the middle shows the number of collaborators in different countries. As you go down the column, there were deeper collaborations. In the case of France, there were 300 people who had some collaboration, and 80 people were collaborators in the very deep level. But for China and Korea, only 15 or 10 collaborators on every level. On the right, you can see the table that shows the percentage of writings collected by esperantists by country. In the case of UK, over 80% of writings were collected by esperantists in the UK. However, for China, Taiwan, and 2 Koreas, South and North, no writing was collected by esperantists. Both in China and Taiwan and in Korea, there were esperantists. However, the freedom for esperantists to have such a communication with other countries was not existent due to the political situation. In China, 1 year before this project, Esperanto was already banned. So, under such circumstances, after all, the editorial staff had to rely on writings sent by the government-backed organization. And Heibonsha editorial staff pointed out that this is not what we want. They sent this message repeatedly to the organization. The photograph on the right is a draft of the letter they sent to the Chinese organization, National Children's Committee for People Protection. And let me read. Quote, "All the writings we received from you are excellent works with skillful expressions, but we sense that many of them were selected through a rigorous screening process. What we need is not a work with fine literal expression or compositional structure. Any writing which tells a life experience of the child will do. We do not mind a bad handwriting or an incompleteness of the work." Unquote. Handwriting, like a serpentine or snake, so the portion I just read means that they don't mind having a bad handwriting, like a serpentine, like a handwriting. So the editorial staff mentioned that it doesn't have to be a fine literal expression. It can be an incomplete work. They don't mind handwriting of poor quality, but they never received such a work from China. Then what about Taiwan, who had a deep relationship with China back then? This material right here is a request concerning collecting writings from Taiwan, and such a request letter was prepared not only for Taiwan but also for other regions. It explains key points editorial staff pay attention to in collecting writings. The red box says as follows. The Kuomintang government moved to Taiwan after they were defeated by the Chinese Communist Army. And it says, Kuomintang government is promoting industrial development and export increase, but the colonial structure established by the Japanese for the sake of their interests remained the same, and the islanders are left in the difficult life as before." Unquote. As Dr. Takayama mentioned at the outset, I had been studying the history of Taiwan, and when I read this passage, it really rang the bell in my mind. Many people know that Taiwan was a Japanese colony in the 1950s, and even today. What happened to Taiwan after it was liberated from the Japanese colonial rule? Very few people pay attention to that part. Under such circumstances, the editorial staff held Japan accountable for the colonial rule of Taiwan, and also point out that the situation remained unchanged under Kuomintang government. And this attention to the colonialism, which continued from before to World after World War II was often missing in the Japanese society, and at the time it was a precious viewpoint, and such a viewpoint was clearly indicated in the letter of request and the collecting process. But such writings were not gathered at all. We find the following conversation in the minutes of the editorial meeting. It says, quote, "It is difficult to send a letter to anyone in Taiwan. It is dangerous. I hear you cannot send a personal letter to Taiwan." Unquote. So, for a Taiwanese to receive a letter from a Japanese itself seems to be a risky situation. And indeed, Taiwan was ruled by the government by terror with the martial law, and often the case the capital punishments were rendered without going through a fair trial process. So this impressions about Taiwan may not be too much of an exaggeration, but as a researcher on Taiwan, I feel sorry about this. Under such circumstances, editorial staff gave up on collecting writings from Taiwan through the private channel and decided to rely upon the government organization. And as we can expect, they gathered many writings full of anti-communist national rebuilding ideology upheld by Chiang Kai-shek government, and there was almost no description of colonial rule experience. The Chinese Kuomintang was ruling in Taiwan, and under the Japanese colonial rule, many Taiwanese were able to only read and write Japanese and not Chinese, and that was more or less looked down by the Kuomintang government. And under such circumstances, it seems very difficult for a Taiwanese to speak on a private basis with anyone like Japanese. Furthermore, Taiwanese didn't read and write Chinese well, and they could read and write Japanese and not Chinese. Taiwanese and Chinese, some of you may think, are very similar with each other. But as a matter of fact, pronunciation and vocabulary are really different, like two totally different languages. And Taiwanese didn't have a developed reading and writing system. So when a child in Taiwan wants to write about their daily life, he or she had to first translate from Taiwanese to Chinese in their mental process. Ironically, as Taiwanese were still under the colonialism-like situation, they had difficulty writing about colonialism-like situation. The children of the world includes writings by Mongolian children in Inner Mongolia Autonomous Region and children of Korean residents in Japan. In those cases too, the translation from their mother tongue to Chinese or Japanese may have taken place as a hidden process. But this project, Children of the World, didn't probe into such a hidden translation process. Unfortunately, in this way, before looking for any quality of Seikatsu Tsuzurikata, DLW, those competitions from Taiwan were bound by significant constraints. That first, they didn't have the enough knowledge about Chinese, and they had to translate from Taiwanese to Chinese first. still, children's drawings sometimes reveal everyday life experience, and this is a sketch of a woman vendor selling products, carrying her baby on the back, and there is a name and age of this particular child, and these drawings really reveal their daily life. So this is a summary of my talk. In Seikatsu Tsuzurikata, breaking down concept was considered important. But ironically, for the project of the children of the world, breaking down the concept of Seikatsu Tsuzurikata itself seemed essential. As I mentioned earlier, within Japanese society, Seikatsu Tsuzurikata could be understood relatively easily. However, among the people who didn't share such a context, what Seikatsu Tsuzurikata meant, the essence of Seikatsu Tsuzurikata, had to be reviewed and explained. But through this process, this project revealed some often overlooked features and points. Firstly, the theme of a composition must not be uniform, but free for Seikatsu Tsuzurikata. This requirement can be met only when freedom of expression is protected. The description of working people may be preferable. This is a more or less a flexibly set theme framework, but children are more or less allowed to write about anything. Secondly, it has an embedded dilemma of collecting essays about private personal lives, which were more like diaries, and then editing and publishing them. For instance, in Echoes from a Mountain School, Muchaku Seikyo published writings by children. It was more or less considered as a violence under the name of education, as it revealed and published the private domain writings. But at the same time, it lay a problem hidden in the private domain, open in the public domain through publication. If you remember the feminist saying, the personal is political. For instance, in a very poor family, to express the poorness is often felt as an embarrassing act. But in that feeling of embarrassment, there lies a political issue and problem. And this project, The Children of the World, shows that daily life writing has these two aspects. And the third one is realism supported by a poetic sensitivity. And realism is not contrasted against poetic sensitivity. And this, again, is a dilemma. Realism is to be supported by a poetic sensitivity, and that's another feature of Seikatsu Tsuzurikata. Nartita Chukyu said, quote, "When you carefully read the children's writings, which pile up like a mountain, I see the land, scenery, and the social mechanism in them, and they touch my heartstrings with joy and sorrow." Unquote. Learning social mechanisms and having a heart-moving experience, they are two separate things, and they should be two separate things. That perhaps is a general understanding, but in Seikatsu Tsuzurikata movement, they try to overcome this dichotomy between the two and present them as something more or less inseparable from each other. Let me summarize my talk by using translation as a keyword. As Naoki Sakai said, translation is not a transparent bridge between multiple languages. It is an attempt of communication often destined to fail. In the first place, the act of writing itself is an attempt to translate from one's primary language, such as the mother tongue and dialect, to a standardized written language. When children of Inner Mongolia of China and children in Taiwan write in Chinese, or when children in Yamamoto village of Yamagata Prefecture and Korean children living in Japan write in Japanese, this process, hidden translation, is at work. But of course, the divide between the primary language and the world of written language may differ from country to country. But when the divide is institutionalized, colonialistic situation of the double culture becomes serious. DLW is a process of trial and error to overcome this divide through a constant act of translation. Children of the World was an important attempt, as it made it possible for children of the world to feel the presence of each other and have empathy toward each other on an individual name basis, and also gave rise to many confrontations and failures in the process of translation. And for that reason, it is a significant enterprise. Thank you very much.